Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Edward Luttwak, who is a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and has served as a consultant to the Office of Secretary of Defense, the National Security Council, the U.S. Department of State, the U.S. Army, Navy, and Air Force, and a number of allied governments as well as international corporations and financial institutions. He's the author of numerous books, two of which I will mention right now, The Logic of War and Peace, which has been published in Chinese, French, German, Hebrew, Italian, Estonian, and Turkish, as well as English editions, and Coup d'etat, which has been published in 14 languages. Edward, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you.
Welcome back to Berkeley. You were here many years ago as a Nimitz lecturer. Where were you born and raised?
Well, I was born in Arad in Transylvania, between Hungary and Romania, or in Romania technically. And I was brought up in Italy. I went to school in Italy and then in England. Mm-hmm. Then eventually, many years later, I came to the United States.
And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world?
Well, you know, it was his parents and circumstances and so on. Well, my mother was highly artistic, and I'm not. And I don't know. I mean, there are some things that I can describe directly to my parents. One of them is that if I see a body of water, I plunge in to swim, mm-hmm. Because they used to do that sort of stuff. But other things are very hard to reconcile. You know, I'm sure a third party could do that and find all kinds of relationships, but I can't. Mm-hmm.
How were how was your family affected by World War II and then by the division of Europe after the war?
Well, my family was a Jewish family, but although they were invited to participate in the Holocaust and so on, they declined the invitation, and they didn't actually have any relationship to it whatsoever. Even though they were right there in the middle of it all. After the war, on the other hand, in November 1947, they left abruptly because the communists were about to take power. This is the week later. Mm-hmm. And even though my father had been extremely skillful in World War II, in maneuvering around all the deadly dangers, he was not particularly alarmed. The king was still in Romania. There was no sign of a takeover. The word was that Churchill and Stalin had made an agreement that Romania would not be communist. The country was, there were no communists in Romania. I mean, all of the communists could fit in a cinema. So there are all these reasons, and the Russians didn't particularly want it. And so it made sense to think that things would go all out. But somebody else intervened. Mm-hmm. A wonderful man from the NKVD, the Russian pre-KGB, who was from Leningrad and who basically told my father, he says, if you stay, you're an idiot. Go to West, you know, even if you'll never make it, you'll never be rich again. You know, you'll probably get the third-hand car somewhere down the line. If you stay here, you'll have nothing. And you will not have your freedom. So he, being an NKVD, that is the military security and intelligence force of the Red Army, of the Russian Army. My father figured he had some credibility, so we left.
How was your consciousness, if this is a fair question, affected by this experience of your family? I mean, obviously you were young, you were very an infant, you know, during World War II, but then afterward, and then you emigrated essentially to Italy and then England.
It's hard to say because, you see, when we left Romania, we didn't run over the hills. Yeah. We went out in the cabins, the stateroom cabins of the only passenger airliner, passenger ship, cruise ship, almost a cruise ship. So yes, there were terrible events, but they were not traumatic events. Mm-hmm. They were not, behind the scenes, horrible things were happening, but they didn't happen to my family or myself. That was because of a great deal of skill and knowledge and expertise in dealing with conflict on the part of my parents. But The fact is that it was not traumatic. So I arrived in Palermo, Sicily. You know, the sun is shining, and there are wonderful, excellent homemade ice cream everywhere, and so on. So that's, I don't know how much one gets from it.
And let's talk a little about your education, which you touched on. So you did your undergraduate work in England, correct?
Well, I did the degree in England.
Yeah.
And
what was that in?
In analytical mathematical economics, which I thought I liked. And then I did nothing except I wrote a couple of books of my own, but eventually...
Mathematical?
No. That book, I did the book on coup d'etat, the one you mentioned.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah,
Okay.
unrelated. I mean, I studied one thing, I did another. And then eventually, many years later, I came to the United States where I was put on the straight path and get the, write a dissertation and get a doctorate, even though I didn't do any coursework, because that was at Johns Hopkins University. In Baltimore in those days, Johns Hopkins felt very confident. And so they didn't ask people to do all kinds of little exams, but they just write a dissertation, get a doctorate.
And what was your dissertation on?
It was on the Roman Empire. I decided to do it in the classics, even though the framework was the Department of Political Science. Robert W. Tucker, the well-known writer of foreign affairs, was my patron, so to speak, there, and I had an advisor and so on.
And what did you focus on in the dissertation? What
Well,
drew you
just
to
how the Roman Empire, it's called The Grand Strategy of the Roman Empire. It became a book, it's still in print, and it's about how the Romans maintained their empire. I come in when the empire already exists. How do they maintain it? How do you preserve an empire which runs from England to Mesopotamia, has an open border in England, which was then like the northwest frontier in Pakistan, it was a wild country. In Mesopotamia, they had to deal with the only other superpower, which was Persia, Sassanid Persia, before that, the Arsacids. So how do you maintain that at tolerable cost? And they had different strategies, and eventually the situation changed and the cost became intolerable. And so you had more and more invasions and eruptions to find the system had to be changed drastically, and then continued as the Byzantine Empire for another 1,000 years. But that's what the dissertation was about, except I stopped at the moment when they run out of options.
Your work and your scholarship is extensive, and it's hard to put you in any one box, but just for purposes of discussion, let's call you a strategist, or at least somebody who throughout your over. So what is involved in doing that work? If students were watching this interview, what skills make a good
strategy is governed by a logic of its own, the logic of conflict. If I want to go from here to San Francisco, downtown San Francisco, I'll try to get the best road to get there. If I'm in the realm of strategy, the best road is the worst road because my enemy waits for me there. So the best way to go to San Francisco might be very circuitous. That very roundabout road is the best road to San Francisco because it is the worst. In other words, the moment you're in conflict, the logic becomes contradictory. And then you develop from there.
Now, is strategy a hard thing to be clinical about as you describe what it really is?
Well, the problem with strategy is that it does conflict with the logic of everyday life. So if you're involved in strategy and you have to explain yourself to outsiders what you're doing, you either read them into this whole logic, or else you have to rationalize what you're doing in common sense terms. And the common sense terms will always be misleading. That's why governments that go to war always have enormous difficulty in explaining why they're going to war. In Harry V, as you remember, in Harry V, there's a discussion about the fact that in France, the Salic law applies. It's the Salic francs, not the riparian francs. And under the Salic law, there can be no succession for the female line, and therefore the King of France is not legitimate. The crown falls to Henry V, who must now go to France and claim the crown. Okay, this is the explanation given for going to war in France. Now, I dare say it wasn't like Henry V got up in the morning and suddenly realized that it was a horrible thing happening, that the Salic law notwithstanding, the French kings, the line of succession, had gone through the female line. Oh, I must go to war. I wanted to go play tennis, but oh no, I have to go to war. Yeah, that's the fundamental difficulty. The governments cannot explain themselves across this barrier between conflict and common sense.
So it would seem that the effort to create a grand strategy for a country the size of America that's also a democracy really increases the difficulty, basically, because you would have to explain things that are very hard to make clear.
Yes and no, because this happens to be a democracy, as you know, and nobody has any right to draw, make a grand strategy for the United States and ram it down the throats of the Americans. I mean, you know, the concept of the ship of state is a monarchical concept. There's the ship of state, and everybody aboard, they're all very obedient sailors, and they do, and then here, this is how the ship of state gets to its destination. Well, the United States also has a ship of state, but the American people are not sailors. They're not members of the... and they're fishermen.
They're fishermen.
Some go fishing, some snorkeling, some are sunning themselves, some are busy playing cards on that deck. They're not there obediently waiting for a captain to descend and saying, well, I figured out the grand strategy, we're going to sail that way. Through the storms, of course, and all that. No, this is different. The crew are very calm and happy. The only time when they get themselves of a strategy and a purpose if somebody attacks them. See, they're all playing cards, fishing, sunning themselves. Somebody attacks, then it does become a ship of state, roaring, all guns roaring, and will continue and make great mayhem. So the answer is you don't have to develop a grand strategy for the United States.
But as I reread the Logic of Strategy, which was first published in the late 80s but has gone through several editions, I was struck by the compelling argument A, and when I tried to apply that to the recent Iraq War, which we're still in the midst of, it became very clear why it was such a disaster. Talk a little about that, because it's as if we didn't take into account the logic that is laid out in your book.
Well, that's a difficulty, because you start with contradiction. Like you want to go to San Francisco, you have to go roundabout route. The contradiction becomes dynamic. When you are trying to do something in the realm of strategy and you keep doing it, instead of achieving your result and getting to where you want to, you will end up in disaster, because everything you do in strategy has a culminating point, and you keep doing, and let's say Napoleon is victorious, so he advances. He keeps advancing, he's more victorious. Finally gets to Moscow, he's now overshot the culminating point of success. And just by simply going on doing what was so successful, he destroys himself. This is the phenomenon. So we have a number of different starting points for Iraq. One of them is that American air power is very formidable. Because it's formidable, it drives people either into passivity, surrender, or simply don't wanting to fight the Americans, or else it forces them to become dispersed and not stand there as an army, but become insurgents, guerrillas, low contrast, low profile, low signature. So it's no use having all the air power because you don't know where they are. So by introducing air power in Iraq, you drive the opposition from an army to an insurgency. When you get into an insurgency, you run into another iron law. That is, the democracies are very powerful when attacked. They're less powerful when they attack. But when they do intense forms of attack, like occupying a foreign country, the iron law is they cannot succeed. Well, you can come to me and say that we're doing really well in Anbar province this week with the tribals, and last week we managed to ambush this Muqtada Sadr guy and kill him because he made a mistake and used his cell phone. But the iron law is that you can have many exceptions, but the iron law is democracies cannot occupy. Any empire can occupy Iraq with ease, A couple of thousand, 3,000 soldiers will be enough for an empire to have complete tranquility in Iraq. But the democracy can't do it because empires out-terrorize the terrorists.
They cannot.
The empire out-terrorize.
The empire can.
Sure, I mean, you don't have to start looking for mines and improvised explosive devices. No, you just say the word. Any village where any vehicle going through any village and the vehicle gets attacked, we kill everybody in the village. So the villagers say it's nothing to do with us. They say, sorry, you're there, you see insurgents putting the bomb, so we kill you all. Now, no democracy can do that. No democracy would want to do that. The idea that, let's say, the American democracy to win in Iraq, to win in such a country as Iraq, would sacrifice its ideals is absurd. So the United States, first, what happens is the group of decision makers who spend serious amounts of time figuring out where to go on holiday, figured out much less effort, decided to go to Iraq and establish a democracy there at the point of the bayonet. Once you arrive in a place like Iraq and talk democracy, all the local priests, in this case the imams, say, oh, they're not really here to... We Iraqis would never go there to help them. So they cannot be here to help us. They must be here to steal the oil. When that turns out not to be so, they're here to destroy Islam. So it's no use offering democracy and freedom and all that. You're going to... Obscurantist religion wins every time. So in a sense, Iraq is an overdetermined outcome. First, you have the idea of bringing democracy to Iraq. It's like you decide that you're sick and tired of all this time wasting, and you're going to bring fast food to Italy. From now on, none of this chopping and this, making the salsa, the pasta, waiting until... No. Yeah, fast food. Selling democracy in a country as poorly educated. That was another thing, They used to go around saying that they were highly educated, they were full of engineers, scientists, and so on. And a country is suffused with religion intensity and fanaticism of religion like Islam, plus lack of education. To offer them democracy is like offering fast food to the Italians. Your chance of success are zero.
You, in some of your writings in Harper's on the Petraeus strategy and the war, you go back into history and you say in 1800 Napoleon tried to put his brother on the throne, offering a liberal constitution. And Spain, Spain.
And Spain, yeah, because you see, we have a census of Spain, and when the French entered in 1810 or whatever, about 3,500 towns and villages and all the lands around were wholly owned by the church. So the French arrived and say, no more paying rent to the church. You peasants, instead of having to give half the crop to the landlord, whether it's church or not, no more, you just keep the crop for yourself. You won't be miserable with your wooden shoes and so on. You're going to be prosperous and so on. The priests, on the other hand, told them, oh, no, the French are not here to help you. They're here because they want to destroy the religion. They're here to attack the Virgin Mary. And what happened is the Spanish believed them, so much so that the word guerrilla, little war, guerrilla, comes from the Spanish resistance to the French, who came to Spain offering them don't pay rent to rent. Well, it was a democracy of sorts, but mainly offering them cold-blooded material advantages, and the priests had no difficulty whatsoever. Same thing happened in southern Italy. Cardinal Ruffo, who coincidentally, I'm sure, was of the largest single land-owning family in Calabria, easily raised an army which was called the Army of the Holy Faith, to go and kill, in fact, burn the liberals who wanted to abolish feudal rights in southern Italy. In other words, obscurantism wins. It's only with the highly educated that, you could land in Sweden with an invasion army and say, we're here to improve your environmental policies by 12%. That you could do, but to send an army to Sweden to do that might be a little exaggerated.
You say also that, going back to this thing about bombing, that as you create the opposite effect that you intend to create, a surgency, then intelligence becomes more and more important to know what's actually going on, and that we're bad at that.
Yes. Americans today can say that American diplomacy is superior, in a particular sense that if you go to, I don't mean some great, Tom Pickering or somebody, ambassador grade, whatever. Now, if you go to an obscure American embassy in Honduras and you talk to the second secretary, he is more hardworking, more competent, more serious than any of his counterparts of other foreign services. Our military, on the other hand, tend to be highly competent in the sense that if they have an MOS, military operational specialty, that they have to be able to refit a tank track on the tank, they know how to do that. In the realm of espionage, on the other hand, which is the human side of intelligence, we have always been enormously incompetent. We failed, during the Cold War, the KGB won all these things, and we only had 4 agents. When the Cold War ended and the archives were open, we found that our agents were their agents, and the guys that we thought had been shot for being such good agents for us were in fact living in dashas outside Moscow. Well, that's because Americans are not good at being secretive. They don't enjoy secret power. It's not. The Russians have a proclivity for secret maneuvering. Americans don't. They like to advertise and talk and stuff. So we have a sociological problem. And during the Cold War, it didn't matter very much because we could photograph, overhead photography of we could see the submarines, we could count them, we could see everything but the submarines, but submarines we could find other ways, we could intercept. But now we're down to human, and there we have the problem called CIA. And anybody who's ever encountered them in the field, and I mean the operational people, the espionage, knows that the solution is to empty out the buildings, fumigate them. And start all over again by hiring the very people they normally reject.
And what is the problem? I mean, why?
It's sociology.
Okay.
Adventurous young American woman comes and says, I want to work for CIA. And they say, oh, you speak Kurdish? That's great. We have nobody who talks Kurdish. Yes, I speak Sorani. There are 3 languages of Kurdistan, of the Kurds. And they say, oh, we didn't know that. How did you learn Sorani? Well, I had this Sorani-speaking boyfriend. Oh, where? In Paris. Why? In other words, they end up hiring people who have studied at high school in Utah, did the University of Utah, and then did many other Utah things, and they say they speak Spanish, and that's how they get in. And they reject systematically the kind of person that they should hire. But, once mediocre provincial people seize any institution of any kind, whereas, it happens in the corporate America all the time. When the mediocre seize a company and refuse to hire the unmediocre, then you have a certain predictable result.
So you've written recently about what to do with Iraq now. As a strategist, help us reflect here. You're very critical of Petraeus' strategy.
Well, Dr. Petraeus, General Petraeus, he has a PhD. That probably is
From
the root of all evil here. He said, if we convert the U.S. Army and Marine Corps into a Mesopotamian constabulary, and we put one at every corner, we'll be able to fight insurgents. Well, I think it was a terrible mistake, and I was very surprised, frankly, that a president would buy this notion. We have 37,500 policemen in New York City. The population of New York is less hostile than in Iraq. They're also less heavily armed, and many more policemen in New York actually have a common language of sorts with the population. So the idea, and they're a decent constabulary. If you wanted to reproduce a constabulary in Mesopotamia with those, put in the number factor, the weapons and language, you probably need 3 million. Then you really could have an American every 2 yards, and the insurgent who does anything gets caught. And so on. Well, we don't have 3 million. And his idea was, well, you can't get 3 million, but give me 30,000 extra. It's like you're going to, jump from across a chasm, and you're going to another yard. It won't make a difference. Very strange, this error, given the iron law that democracies cannot occupy, that democracies cannot defeat insurgencies. You say to them, oh, what about the British in Malaysia? Yes, thank you very much. I'll give you the British in Malaysia. Democracies cannot. Every empire can do it very easily. No democracy can. And that's the thing that so what's the answer? Disengagement. Disengagement. That is, withdraw back to some main base outside Baghdad, reduce the numbers from 160 to 16,008. Don't go patrolling the alleys and the streets. Let the Iraqis have their own history. Let them have their own destiny. Let the natural equilibrium emerge between the Sunni and the Shia and the Kurds and so on.
And you're really suggesting that the neighbors, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and so forth, Syria, we would in a way give ourselves more leverage by making a commitment to disengage and bring them in, not necessarily actually intervening, but they would create a supportive environment.
Well, actually, the reason not to simply abandon the place and to simply to reduce from 160 to 16 and to go back maybe to Camp Victory outside Baghdad or some other such place, is precisely to be able to deter foreign invasions. You want the Iraqis to have their own history and let them have their own equilibrium. You don't want foreigners to come in. So you say, we're still here. Anybody who invades Iraq, we're going to clobber them. Unfortunately, air power can be used against them. If it comes to that. You don't intervene. You don't invade. You can intervene surreptitiously when you get all this time. We can't stop you, but you can't invade. And then create, in effect, an arena where the Iraqis can find their own equilibrium. But whether they do or they don't, the United States cannot occupy. Notwithstanding Dr. Petraeus and his theories, he wrote a huge counterinsurgency manual, this big, in order to get around, to square the circle of how you're going to win irregular war with perfectly regular forces. No special forces, no, regular forces, because he's a regular guy. And B, how a democracy will be the first one to occupy. As I say, empires have no problems occupying. The Germans occupied Europe with ease in the Second World War. The resistance was mainly in post-war films and songs. During the war, the Germans went to the bar, they drank, they used the Polish railways, they fought the whole Eastern Front. They kept the whole war with Russia going through the Polish railways, operated by Polish railwaymen. And they did it because anybody stepped out of the line, they massacred them. They used massacre. Not one Abu Ghraib, but 50. And Abu Ghraib ending with people being shot against the wall. You become an insurgent against us, we're going to put you in Abu Ghraib and humiliate you and then shoot you. And all of these things that no democracy would want to do. And that's why democracy should not occupy. Don't occupy. You want to be a democracy? Do not occupy foreign countries under whatever name or excuse.
You've written that we overemphasize the importance of the Middle East. Talk about that. Because you're taking a very contrarian view.
Well, a contrarian up to a point. This is, first of all, in the planet we have today China, we have India, we have the Russian Federation. So we have a U.S. government that allocates all of its energies and time to what a small number of people are doing in a small part of the world, and they have no time to deal with Russia, China, India, or anything else. We have the issue of who these people are. From Morocco to India, if you take away oil, the total product, that is all they do, the whole agricultural, industrial, commercial activity is less than Spain. Okay? And Spain is not, the top. They don't produce anything. Consumption, even extravagant consumption, is not an industry. As for oil has never been a solution. It's always been a problem. And I say that because imagine what would happen if that famous pipeline in Ras Tanura, the one that delivers, I forget, what is 6 or 7 or 5 billion barrels a day, of the global consumption of 80, about 5 or 6 is from that one pipeline. And there's always been speculation what would happen if it gets blown up. If it gets blown up, then oil would go up to $200 a barrel, whatever it happens. We would then finally start doing all the things that we should have done, even if oil were free, which is not to have 8-cylinder SUVs, not to waste energy in all kinds of manners, not to cut down entire forests in order to, make a book like An Inconvenient Truth of Al Gore or whatever, that, or any other book for that matter. In other words, the Middle East is unimportant because it doesn't produce anything, neither material products nor cultural products. I mean, all the universities from Morocco to India together don't have the intellectual output of very minor universities like, I don't know, University of Torino in Italy or something. So what is there? Only oil. And is oil a substance that we should be so dependent on? The answer is no. So that is a whole category. And the second category is this. Assuming that I'm entirely wrong, that the Middle East is awfully important, I just note that the next thing that happens is doing something about it. And whatever is done about it fails. So even if it were important, whether you bomb, you invade, or you're very nice, it all fails. Fails. So it is what I would call an overdetermined argument. On the one hand, we are spending too much effort and time and attention on the Middle East in a world where India, China, Russia, and the rest, and Europe, of course, are infinitely more important. And our neighbors, Latin America, are infinitely more important. And secondly, when under the heading of importance we spend time in the Middle East, whatever we do fails. I mean, remember, the Russians embraced the Arab cause. They broke relations with Israel. They waged a worldwide campaign against Israel, sided entirely with the Arabs, supplied them with huge amounts of weapons, only some part of which was paid. They provided economic aid, industrial aid, everything. And then they got kicked out to the Middle East. So embracing doesn't work. Bombing doesn't work. So, liberals believe that if you're only nice to them, wonderful things will happen. Answer, they won't. They will evoke another reaction, a paranoid rejection, as the Russians did. Or the other people say, bomb them. And that doesn't work either. So, as I say, it's overdetermined.
If the next president were to ask you to give some thoughts about what our strategy should be, assuming they take your advice about the Middle East, what should we be thinking about with regard to this 21st century world in which...
disengage, let the area have its own history, do the minimum. And if you have to act, do it in a raiding fashion. Don't go and invade the whole country. If you're really convinced that they are fabricating, the ultimate nuclear, biological, Pepsi-Cola bomb, whatever they're doing, go and bomb the building. But don't invade the country. Don't try and convert them. Don't push democracy. Don't not push democracy. And mainly, as an American president, my greatest piece of advice would be to appoint a slow person as Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Middle East and have all of the Middle Eastern parties deal only with him and have him report slowly and reluctantly to the assistant secretary for whatever, and then have him report slowly to the undersecretary and have the undersecretary never speak to the president. This way, in other words, this was the advice of Bismarck. I'm not being original here.
Yeah.
Chancellor Bismarck, noticing that European powers were about to go to war over the Eastern question, which was Ottoman, what to do about Ottoman Turkey. Instead of saying, there are Turks there, let Turks living there, let them deal with Ottoman Turkey. Oh no, it's going to be the French, the British, and they're going to go this and that, and the Russians, and Constantinople. And Bismarck said, I've studied the question. I've noticed that the smallest part of Germany is producing more than the whole of the Middle East. Mm-hmm. The whole of the Middle East is not worth the bones of one Pomeranian grenadier. So he was right. Mm-hmm. But why do we get drawn into it? Because there's an absence of great power confrontation. Mm-hmm. And therefore, it's a sort of slide into it kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Now, as I say, if there are real dangers, go and bomb that building. I don't mean the country or the people or the capital city. There's a building and they're doing evil things, blow it up. Mm-hmm. But don't go around invading other countries and telling them what to do, because you know we can't do it. Mm-hmm. Now, you know, if somebody says we're going to abandon American democracy and set up an empire where we take insurgents and put them in the Colosseum and have them fight each other and all these other things, I might go for that. But so long as we are a democracy, do not occupy. Mm. That means don't invade. That means leave alone.
So let's say the president checks off, the new president checks off, implement. So
right.
That is more. What about the emerging powers like China and India? Do they pose a threat? What should our strategy be toward them?
Well, I know that people have already written 1,000 books on China as the next superpower. Well, I suppose, yes, if the Chinese were Prussians or Europeans or even Anglo-Saxon, the Chinese happen to be Chinese. I think history should not be entirely disregarded. I mean, I'm not a historicist, but the only times in history when the Chinese were active, geopolitically active, was when under the Yuan dynasty, which were Mongols, Kublai Khan and all that, conquered China, then they expand. Then much later, when did China take over Tibet? It was under the Manchus, who are another non-Chinese people. Manchu China expands and tries to be geopolitical. The Chinese themselves have always expanded demographically. So from a Chinese point of view, you have a ballistic nuclear weapon. What are you going to target? San Francisco? From their point of view, San Francisco is an emerging Chinese city. They're going to bomb themselves. Well, they could bomb Washington, but that would mean that they're operating geopolitically. They never did historically. Mm-hmm. Why should they now? I mean, the Chinese economy has expanded enormously, but does this make China powerful? I think it makes Chinese rich. Mm-hmm. You see, Chinese don't play it the European way. Whenever in Europe they had a couple of, thalers or liras or sovereigns or francs, they immediately gave one to the government to wage a war. Well, when the Chinese have 2 francs, they like to keep it for themselves. Mm-hmm. Europeans were always proffering their sons to join the army. The Chinese believe that you should only join the army because it has a good dental program. It's not their style to be geopolitical. Mm-hmm. And I would be very surprised if China undergoes a cultural transformation and having money will then use the money to build battleships and raise regiments of cavalry and infantry and start conquering places. Mm-hmm. I'd be very surprised if they do that, in territorial terms or any other terms. I do know that they're going all around the world, particularly in Africa, overpaying for commodities. Turn out to be a very bad investment. They always
yes,
are.
the dollar declines, right? Yeah.
Yeah, they always are. And, the same goes for India. I mean...
So I guess I'm curious. Look, you've worked on Rome. You've really studied empires. You studied the Cold War. You're working on a book on Byzantium. What is the interplay between institutions and ideas that make a great power, a hyperpower, a superpower successful or not as it deals with the world?
Well, first of all, the impulse. You have to have something spare. You have to have a little extra money. Mm-hmm. You have an army that is not occupied in protecting its borders. You have some idle regiments. So you keep looking at these regiments and saying, well, can you do something with them? What about grabbing something with them? So if you are a king, then you say, I have 12 spare regiments. Let me see if I can seize a province with that. Since those days, we have progressed. Now you have 12 regiments there, idle in a parade ground. And you say, what country can I save? Mm-hmm. Are we going to intervene in Darfur to stop that awful conflict? Are we going to go and remove that awful dictator Saddam Hussein? Should we intervene in Burma, Myanmar? In other words, the excuses vary. Mm-hmm. The basic point is having the extra regiments idling there on the parade ground. In other words, you don't do anything if you don't have a surplus. Mm-hmm. You have a power surplus. And the issue is, why do you have a power surplus? Because your institutions raise more troops than you need. So I'm a great believer in war, and I think it's a great thing. However, unnecessary war starts with this extra. Mm-hmm. We had the Cold War. We were in a conflict with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, you can make fun of it all you like now, but at the time, the Russians could have invaded the whole of Western Europe with their tanks that weren't quite great and their technology that wasn't quite there. They were immensely powerful, and the United States needed an immense effort to balance them off, block them, and keep them boiling in their own pot until they gave up. Well, we don't have this threat now. Mm-hmm. So dismantling, reducing the military force drastically would be the appropriate thing. Instead, what happens is that we don't. And so when we are attacked on September 11, we do the entirely right thing and use a tiny fraction of our military power with a great deal of skill, a great deal of capability from the special forces and so on. And you go to Afghanistan and overthrow the Taliban. Mm-hmm. But we were enormously provoked September 11. So now we punch back. And the Taliban, who are supposed to, people forget, they were supposed to be fanatical resistors. They did this and that, the mountains, Ramadan, Afghanistan, you fell. Well, the Taliban fled like rabbits. So we had this we were very angry, we punched, there's nothing there. So we look around and Saddam Hussein is standing there, lying about having weapons of mass destruction. Remember, everybody believed he had them, including the French President Chirac. Everybody believed he had them. He acted like a man with a gun. So, it's a surplus of power. We came out of the Cold War with too much power. We were attacked by a bunch of terrorists on September 11. We quite rightly knocked off the Taliban to remove the country that they had made their own. And then we proceeded with projects. Mm-hmm. The democracy project. There is highly educated Iraqis just waiting to become Democrats. And then comparisons with the industrialized country called Germany, the industrialized country called Japan, and so on.
You actually write in I think the Logic book in the later edition, in the wake of the Soviet collapse, there is such a thing as culminating point of success in maximizing the leverage of the United States on the world scene. To overshoot that point, to exceed the limit of what others can accept with sufficient equanimity, must result in diminished rather than increased power and influence.
Right. Yeah, we were very powerful to defeat the Soviet Union. Soviet Union collapses. We didn't quite defeat it, we collapsed. So by simply being powerful, we evoke resistance. Mm-hmm. And yes, and then that resistance kind of checkmates us so that we become weaker. So if we had had a more drastic reduction in our military forces and our activism, See, the September 11th thing came off nowhere, but out of a group of fanaticals. There always are. They're anarchists at the beginning of the last century, used to go around killing people and so on. And by the way, our military power has never been much use against them because they are elusive targets. They're low contrast. And so yes, that's why I wrote it before it happened. I wrote it before it happened because it was so obvious that we were overshooting the culminating point where power is useful.
Do we have a problem of political imagination now as we approach, we're into the 21st century, but we really have to deal with it? Are we going to have a lot of atavistic institutions and old ideas that we keep trying to replay, or will we see that it's a different world? And if so, what would be a new idea for that world?
Well, I think that, I do think that our intellectual... We have a problem intellectually. I think that we keep refusing to accept the realities of power and of conflict. The people who study conflict, for example, in this university, don't like conflict. They dislike war. They therefore fail to recognize some very basic aspects of war. One of them is that war is a great deal of fun. Historically, wars have been fought by people who wanted fun. Since all but a handful of wars were fought by volunteers, then it must be that war is attractive. Their starting point is the war can never be attractive. War is horrible. I'm going to do a documentary about the war. It's going to show how horrible it is, and only horrible. The answer is it's not true. And we therefore have a problem because we are not applying our intellects to understand the phenomenon. Instead, we apply our emotions to attack it. And this lack of intellectual capital was very manifest, in my view, after the end of the Cold War. At the end of the Cold War, we should have realized what I wrote, which is pretty simple. We are terribly powerful, but the Russians are terribly powerful. So a lot of countries support this because they're afraid of the Russians. Russians go, and even if they have no particular hostility to us, they must turn against us if now our power is not there to offset Russian power. So the failure to understand these things, instead being dragged off by very low-level stuff like the very minor interests of the defense companies, which are very weak, actually, politically, and don't count for anything. It's a great myth that they're powerful. They're not. It's a lack of clear understanding of these things. There's a lack of intellectual application to it. If we studied war as carefully as we studied butterfly, instead of people saying, I hate butterflies, imagine what would happen if you went in a scientific world and you have people studying things they hate. What would be arguably this is what happens to the so-called war on cancer, which is that a lot of the work done is very valid so long as it's not related to the attempt to stop cancer tomorrow. There is such a thing as an inability to understand things.
So, and you argue in the recent editions of The Logic of War that we're in a post-heroic era. So we don't want to have casualties. We want to use the Air Force to in a way devastate from afar. But in a way that keeps the engine of war going, even as we see that we're saving our lives, but not lives of
others. Well, that's because at the end of it, there are from very wicked foreigners. See, wicked. The sequence is this. We have this extra power, so we use it. But in using it, we have undergone social change. We have small families, and therefore casualties are unacceptable. Look at the casualties of the Iraq War. 4 years of war, the total number of casualties in Iraq is so small that arguably some months...
On our side.
Yeah, they're so small that we would lose more servicemen if they didn't go to Iraq, because once they're here, they drive, they have accidents. On the other hand, our tolerance for casualties has become very low. And therefore, what's the sovereign remedy? Use the Air Force. Well, you can use the Air Force, but only if foreigners are nice and willingly assemble in conveniently targetable mass formations. The insurgents all stand there like good and proper people instead of being evil and wicked and hide. If they stood there, we could clobber them with their power, but we can't, and they won't. They won't stand there in conveniently targetable mass formations. Therefore, we have to rethink these things from the beginning. And as I said, there's a need here for serious thought, and not by people who don't enjoy war. It's for people who do like war, and therefore open their minds to it and understand how you end up in a cul-de-sac. How you end up with Dr. Petraeus recommending, General Petraeus recommending that we send 30,000 more troops as if this could ever possibly make a difference. If you're short of constabulary, it's like saying problems in some cities, too much crime, we need one more policeman.
Yeah.
You're going to solve the problem with police, then you need to saturate the place. So it's all very, so you have the anti-war crowd not studying the phenomenon because they hate it, and the pro-war crowd buying Dr. Petraeus or General Petraeus or whatever his name is, this kind of simplistic solution that if you have 3 more insurgents, send 3 more soldiers. When the insurgents don't show themselves, they're not gentlemanly, they don't come out with a nice label insurgent. So that is the intellectual problem we have. And historically, the solution of the American people has been that when we got involved in these adventures, they would look for a president who wouldn't, who would stay at home.
But we clearly have to break the cycle, because we could elect a president who will get us out on the terms you describe. But really, you're suggesting that there should be an entirely different
Yes,
agenda.
an entirely different
and
thing.
what would that look like?
Well, the agenda would be a functional agenda. In other words, do it cold-bloodedly and seriously. Are you worried about Iran nuclear weapons? Well, Iran nuclear weapons is a story of 7 buildings in 3 places. Bomb the buildings. Don't think of changing the regime of Iran, changing the government of 68 million people. Don't try to understand this phenomenon of Iran. I mean, is this the most arrogant thing of all? Is precisely what a lot of liberals advocate, which is to understand. I mean, so you have now the phenomenon as follows. A senator in Massachusetts asked him, what are we going to do about the schools in Mississippi? He says, oh my God, how could I know? Mississippi is so different. It's got such a different politics in Mississippi. Anything I recommend would be wrong. The same guy has a perfect answer for Pakistan, Kashmir, Iran, and so on. He won't go from Massachusetts to Mississippi, but in Afghanistan, he knows everything. So the answer is, don't understand. If you feel threatened by a specific thing, deal with it. But don't try to change regimes or invade countries, because you know what? They're even more distant and difficult to understand than Mississippi.
You seem to be suggesting, as we've gone through this discussion, that there is a provincialism about America, which has in a way been corrupted, that prevents us from seeing the subtlety, the complexity of the world.
Absolutely, but it's not America.
Okay.
It has to do with being big and powerful. Remember when the Romans were big and powerful, they had a complete failure to pay attention to the outside world. In fact, when 2 Roman gentlemen would say, I wonder what goes on north of Germany, they would go and open a copy of Ptolemy. The Greek writing in Egypt wrote a book about geography. Let's look up what Ptolemy says is north of Germany or east of Iran or something. With great power comes a lack of intellectual curiosity. With great power comes this willful ignorance of the outside world. It's not for nothing that, for example, in the 19th century, the British had colonies everywhere. But if you look who were the travelers who wrote it up and so on, some of them were civil servants, some British civil servants and governors, but a lot of it were Hungarians, the famous travelers of Central Asia, came from small countries. So yes, there is something, but it's not peculiarly American. It has to do with being a great empire. Being a great empire it means A, you're preoccupied internally. And secondly, it means that you see everything in terms of force and power and not in terms of knowledge. And therefore, if you, let's say today you go to Amsterdam and stop people in the street and ask people about basic questions about foreign countries, you'll find the Dutch are much better informed than the British. The British are better informed than the Americans. The Americans are better informed than the Romans were, because the Romans were more powerful since they dominated the whole world that they cared about and had no real position in it. But, for example, the ignorance of Latin America. We are here next to Latin America. Could take a car and drive into it. The complete ignorance of Latin America. The fact that, for example, most Americans that know about Mexico, they know about the border towns where they went to get drunk once. They don't know the whole heterogeneity of Mexico and all,
And its history.
And its history and its culture and why Chiapas tastes one way, Oaxaca tastes another, and why the north and the south and the west and the east are different in culture, and why it's our ignorance of Latin America can only be given that so many Americans speak Spanish or even of Spanish origin, so-called not Spanish, Hispanic as they call it, Hispanic. They know Spanish. The complete lack of interest in Latin America, the total lack of curiosity, that is only the result of power.
Edward, on that note, and actually something to really think about, I want to thank you very much for being here today, and we look forward to having you again when your new book on Byzantium comes out.
Oh, yes. Thank you.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.